Welcome to the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective. I'm Tony Aguilar. On today's podcast, as the people of Malaysia went to vote in 6 of their 13 states, Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim was hoping to increase his party's control over parliament. But as the conservative opposition seems to be gaining favor with the Malay population, how will this affect the Prime Minister's agenda? The politics of Malaysia, its implications for the nation, the region, and global politics. Next. Joining me from London is Bridget Welsh. She is a senior research associate of the Hufang Center for East Asian Democratic Studies of the National Taiwan University and a senior associate fellow of the Habibi Center. She also serves as an honorary research fellow with the University of Nottingham, Malaysia's Asia Research Institute. An author of several books, she is co-author of the book Regime Resilience in Malaysia and Singapore. She has also been a consultant for Freedom House, the World Bank, and the United Nations, and presently serves on the Research Council for the International Forum of Democratic Studies of the National Endowment for Democracy. Bridget, thanks for joining me today.
Great to be here, Tony.
Bridget, there seems to be a trend within the Malay community, within Malaysia, that seems to be heading towards the right, particularly with young people. I mean, what's driving that trend now towards conservatism?
So I think there are two dimensions of what's happening. The first of which is that Malaysia is following the global trend. We see the rise of more right-wing conservative forces, challenging and capitalizing on economic discontent, sense of displacement, resentment. These are, issues that are very deeply embedded globally. And as a result also of social media, of how people get their information, there isn't kind of this middle ground. So we see this kind of ideological trend. So Malaysia follows this global trend. At the same time, there are domestic forces in Malaysia in that the Malay community, the parties that have traditionally served the Malay community and have had tapped into traditional Malay nationalism for decades, have really had leadership crises, particularly affected by corruption. And so new forces have emerged and to capitalize on that, and particularly feeding into the rise of Islamist forces in Malay society, particularly among the role of expansion of religious education, the kind of expansion of kind of Islamist rhetoric. And so we see this new kind of more conservative right-wing nationalism that has capitalized repeatedly in the last two elections in Malaysia, galvanizing not only young voters, but voters from all ages. They made significant gains electorally, winning over 20% of the Malay community in the last state election, which was held on August 12th.
Given that the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Ibrahim, expected to really increase his control over Parliament, but because he failed to do that, this is going to have a profound influence on his agenda. How is his agenda going to shift because of that? And to give you an example, he had told Al Jazeera once that Malaysia must change in order for it to survive. And he meant that there must be something done with ethnic tensions within the country. But then that was kind of contradicted by a meeting he had with college students in which he was challenged, why can't Malaysia be more diverse, and act upon that premise. And what some would say was a bullying of the student, he began to say, we can't go that way. So which is it for President Ibrahim in terms of being diverse or having to really appeal to the Malay population, which is the majority of Malaysia?
So Anwar Ibrahim, who's prime minister, he came into power in 2022, but he's well known globally because he was a leading figure, the deputy prime minister in the early 90s, up through the crisis of 97 when he was arrested for challenging Mahathir Mohamad. And subsequently, he became the leader in the opposition, pushing for reform. And the challenge is that he is a product of the past. So the past sort of sees Malaysia politics as having the majority of the Malay community, or the support of the majority community. And Malaysia society and politics is divided along ethnic lines. So on one side, you can see that he has been trying to galvanize and to garner support among the Malay community. And he came in with a very weak base in 2022, relying heavily on alliances with other parties. And in this state election, he didn't win that much Malay support. And the Islamist and the more ethno-nationalist forces on the right that we just spoke about gained the most, almost 75%. So there is this kind of tension because traditionally the conceptualization of legitimacy has always been this sense of having at least a share or a majority of the Malay community behind you. He doesn't have that. At the same juncture, the non-Malay communities are the ones that support him. And there is a sense that he takes a lot of the non-Malay support for granted. And of course, they've become less demographically significant, but they're still very important from a perspective of political control because of the party, the way the seats are configured and so forth. So what we see is that there is this contradictory tension in Anwar Ibrahim's leadership, a dependence on the support across multiracial communities, at the same time, a desire to expand and to build a base to the majority community in the society. And Anwar Ibrahim has, galvanized support by promising reforms to address some of the ethnic inequalities and discrimination in Malaysian society. But at the same time, he doesn't have much space to do that because he doesn't have support from the majority community. And so we see these contradictory statements because he's between a rock and a hard place from a perspective of the traditional divides and ethnic polarization that exists within Malaysia, and also is translated into ethnic voting as well. So it's very hard to move away from that. And so we see these contradictory statements.
Now, he did come to office because of a coalition government. That is how we has had to govern, and particularly because Malaysia is a constitutional monarchy. The king wanted to have a coalition a coalition government. Will he be able to bring the opposition into this coalition, or is that simply not a possibility at this stage?
In Malaysian politics, what we learned in the last 5 years, this is a country that had this, the same party in power for 60 years. And then the last 5 years, it's had 5 prime ministers. It's had multiple elections. So it's had a lot of transition and new coalition arrangements. So bringing in the possibility of the Islamist party or the kind of the right-wing Malay Nationalist Party of Bersatu, which make up the opposition now, into the government, one can never fully rule that out completely. But I do think that the space to doing that from the perspective of Anwar Ibrahim's current coalition partners is somewhat limited. And so he does have this Malay deficit. The question is, how will he be able to address that? I think there could be alternatives besides bringing them to the coalition, such as a memorandum of understanding. But the problem rests is that the opposition is unwilling to kind of step back and say, elections are over, it's time for compromise, it's time for governing. The opposition is in a mode of wanting to push for power, to try to change the government through forming a different type of coalition. And so this creates, these pressures for instability. And while they don't have the numbers, and they're really far from that, they're using this type of instability rhetoric and pushing more undemocratic discourse that has, in a sense, put pressure on the government and opened up has kept the issue of whether or not they might be part of a coalition on the table, but unlikely given the circumstances because of the the intensive kind of bad blood between the different coalition partners. Keep in mind that many of the current opposition are now facing legal charges. So there is a lot of tension between the different partners, the different parties in Malaysia, which of course contribute to why we see this kind of more toxic and much more polarized political system right now.
Part of that, part of the issue has come because he has had to go to the right a little bit. And for example, human rights organizations do watch what he's doing right now. So for example, his his policy over the LGBTQ community, children's rights, women's rights, he has had to move to the right. How is that going to be perceived long term with the Malaysian population? Because one of the problems is, as I've seen, even the youth population, even the young population, seems to be going conservative. And much as you said before, that seems to be a global trend in a lot of places. But what is this going to mean for human rights concerns in Malaysia going forward?
So Anwar's government has been in power for only 8 months, and it's still finding its feet. It has new coalition partners that are frenemies, that have gone worked together, never worked together. They've been political enemies for many years. Particularly the Malay Nationalist Party UMNO is now part of his coalition. So what Anwar's strategy has been is to been focusing on trying to strengthen the economy. And this, of course, is not something very easy to do because, there not only needs to be political reforms, there also need to be economic reforms. And so what we saw in the state elections is that there continues to be massive economic discontent. And I think that to understand why the right is gaining is to understand also that this is driven by economic forces, not just ideological forces. But Anwar's strategy in these 8 months has been to pander to conservative forces. So not just on LGBTQ issues, but also on religious conservatism, also on issues of not wanting to create space for rights in terms of book banning and arresting people for sometimes on issues of freedom of speech. So there has been this sense that the type of governance has not fit with the kind of reformasi agenda that Anwar was associated with for many decades. So the question now is whether or not this is going to continue. The problem, however, is that given the opposition has strengthened and given that the government is still on defensive mode, that what we have seen is that they continue to go back to these trigger responses of pandering to conservatism, as well as using and relying on the levers of power to stay in power. And so to answer your question on issues of human rights and reform in these areas, the space doesn't look very open at this particular juncture. And this is one of the challenges because there becomes a process of delegitimation among many of those who voted for Anwar Ibrahim that are expecting some sort of liberalization. So they come out with statements saying, the time to remove the bills that allow for sedition charges and allow for arrest and arbitrary arrest, the time to remove those is too soon. Well, this is the situation. They're continuing to use these levers as potential ways to stay in power.
Let me ask you a question on this. One of their neighbors, Singapore, which used to be merged with Malaysia, has taken a different tack and is seen to have done better economically. If that's the case, has there ever been a desire or at least a willingness to look at the Singapore model and to ask the question, how would that model work in Malaysia? Not that Singapore is perfect because they've been getting an increase in ethnic tension lately as well. But overall, has anyone really looked at how do we utilize their model to make our economy work and our society work better as well?
So I think, first of all, Malaysia looks at Singapore, and there are lots of kind of conflicting sentiments because, of course, they were one nation together from 1959 to 1965 until Singapore was kicked out of Malaysia in 1965. Now, what we see is kind of different ethnic configurations, but one has to understand that Singapore is essentially a city-state with not even 10% of Malaysia's population from a perspective of about overall in terms of the issues and from a perspective of governance. But they have instilled kind of in the early years the focus on meritocracy, the focus on anti-corruption, the focus on building institutions, particularly the civil service. And they've allowed space for these things to be instilled in terms of kind of focus on deliverables. Singapore's contemporary governance models are really under strain compared to the past. But I think that those practices of the past, I think, provide important lessons. Malaysia is very cognizant of that because of the close synergy. But I think the challenges of imposing a kind of Singapore model for Malaysia are complicated because of the ethnic politics in Malaysia. Number two, the larger population. Three, the more systematic challenges of institutional decay that have gone on for such a long time. And so, in a sense, the Singapore model was an option of the past, not necessarily an option of the future. Malaysia, it turned 60 this year, and what we're seeing is a situation where Malaysia has an opportunity to kind of rebuild its own type of model. And this is where the Anwar Ibrahim prime ministership is so important, because it's another window to potentially have systematic reforms. We've seen some reforms in some laws. For example, Malaysia has reduced and removed the death penalty, which Singapore still uses, right? We've seen a recognition of trying to introduce and change some aspects of the civil service. But the implementation of these things has been uneven. So the answer is, I don't think the Singapore model fits Malaysia because Malaysia is a very different place now. But ultimately, however, there are some lessons in terms of reducing corruption and building institutions that I think Malaysians can learn from.
One of the issues in terms of corruption was the Malaysia Development Board and the former prime minister and his participation in that, in millions, if not billions of dollars being siphoned off of that. It brought in the notion of Goldman Sachs being implicated in that as well. Are people still feeling the effects of that? And is that something that is still covering Malaysian politics as people think about it?
So the 1MDB scandal, which you spoke about, is the largest kleptocracy scandal in the world. And when I think the dimes are counted, we're going to find that this is something in the range of 10 billion US dollars. The US Department of Justice found around 4 billion, but the numbers are still those only covered some parts of the funds. It's much larger. And as you rightly noted, it involved Goldman Sachs. It involved involved jurisdictions of 8 countries, a multi-pronged financial scandal across that was global in scope. It's still relevant in Malaysia for 3 reasons. Number one, Najib Razak, who was the prime minister who was the chairman of 1MDB during this time, and there were issues involved in terms of not only the creation of the fund, but also what happened when there was the release and information about the fund, what steps were taken after. He's on trial. So he's on trial for 1MDB. And so we constantly hear about the testimony of what is going on. So he's been convicted on one element of the scandal, but this is now the big 1MDB trial. Malaysians, this is a scandal that's gone on since 2015 when it was released. Malaysians are very fatigued by this conversation, but it is important. The second issue is that the financial cost of 1MDB will affect Malaysians for generations because there is the debts that have to go with bailing out this particular scandal. And I think many Malaysians don't recognize the financial implications because it's something seen as far away from them. But I think there is that particular dimension. The third thing is that Najib's party, which has performed extremely badly in the last general election and in 2018 when it lost power and tied into this scandal. And in 2022, because his protege led the party, he also, in the state elections that happened in August this year, his party also performed badly. There is demands for Najib's release out of prison because they think about him as being they think about other things in his legacy, which about the economy and others. And it is a politicized issue within the context of Anwar Ibrahim's coalition. Najib Razak brings back a sense of nostalgia for many of the party members because there was a lot of money going around. And so Najib Razak and his involvement in this scandal still sort of looms large, even in the contemporary government. And he is a major player in Malaysian politics. He's still a figure that cannot be dismissed because he has his supporters.
I want to turn to some external issues right now, and particularly there is tension within Southeast Asia. As you know, the issue of South China Sea is a point of contention with China. China wants to claim the whole thing, which goes against international law. How do you think that's going to play out? I mean, militarily, obviously, China dwarfs Malaysia, and China does not recognize international law decision when it comes to the South China Sea. And this is on top of the fact that Malaysia, I believe a few months ago, had actually seized a Chinese ship because of their incursion into trying to loot a British ship from World War II. And so, how do you think that tension is going to be resolved, if at all?
So, what we see is a situation where China's power in Southeast Asia has grown precipitously. At the same time, China's economies and economic slowdown has really impacted Southeast Asian economies. And so many of the countries in Southeast Asia have to choose very delicate balancing between a kind of hedging strategy as well as a strategy that allows for engagement, especially from the economic perspective in terms of trying to facilitate investment and growth and others, because China is the economic powerhouse in Southeast Asia, even in its weaker point. So when a security issues like the South China Sea come up, where the smaller countries are much weaker compared to where they were, say, even 5 years ago, the position becomes a very delicate one to handle and to negotiate. This is where the relationship with the United States becomes very important from a perspective of Southeast Asian countries, because they know they want to have a little bit of balancing in the kind of the security ties. But it also has to do with which battles they choose to fight and why they choose to fight them. I think Malaysia is very conscious of its territorial integrity. It has had longstanding claims and very legitimate claims to many areas in the South China Sea. And I think it tries to push these things as best it can. But there is a sense that the power of Southeast Asian countries is weaker than it was. In part also because ASEAN as a body is very fragmented and divided over it. So it used to be that they would rely on the regional organization of ASEAN to be able to come as a balancer vis-a-vis China. Now we see a more divided ASEAN over multiple issues, including Myanmar, as well as the South China Sea. And so what we see are kind of many strategic type of relationships that try to balance on these areas. We've seen a kind of very proactive position that the Philippines has taken, which has allowed Malaysia more space to also take positions. And I think Malaysia wrestles with how to galvanize. Its approach has been multi-pronged. And I think one has to give Malaysia credit for, trying to defend its territory within the context of a situation where it's much harder to do so.
Staying with the influence of the United States for a moment and the relationship between Malaysia and the U.S., because the U.S. is the largest investor in Malaysia, even though China is the largest trading partner. But one of the things that has come up when Prime Minister Ibrahim went to China to meet with President Xi Jinping, one of the things that was discussed was a decreasing of reliance on the US dollar, which obviously doesn't sit well with the United States. So when you talk about hedging, what is Mr. Ibrahim really hedging here? Does he think that the that China will ultimately surpass the United States? Because that's a pretty big issue, and a number of countries have talked about how to get away from the U.S. dollar. But Malaysia is a security partner; an investment partner. What's his thinking on that when it comes to that issue?
So first of all, I think that one of the challenges that Southeast Asian countries face, including Malaysia, is that U.S. policy towards Southeast Asia is driven myopically through the lens of China. And so, as a consequence, they see the country's positions vis-a-vis how they talk about China. So, what the currency being an example of that, right? And I think this is one of the weaknesses of the Biden administration's policies towards Southeast Asia, because people don't know what that policy is, except for a position where people are felt to take positions between China and the United States. Now, for many Southeast Asian countries, the strong dollar has had an impact on their economies. And Malaysia's ringgit has depreciated considerably during this period of time. And so I think, Southeast Asian countries, including Malaysia, are looking to find a way to diversify their financial currency, the dependence on different types of currencies. This conversation about a move away from the dollar is not a new one. And I think it should be seen less as kind of not choosing the United States and more about Southeast Asian countries finding a more diversified strategy for their financial security in that context. But it's hard, right? Because people see this in these kind of black and white lenses. You either for the dollar or against the dollar in this context. I think that from the perspective of Malaysia, they're cognizant of where investment is coming from. And U.S. investment is largely in the manufacturing sector, and it's been a steady form of investment. But there hasn't been significant growth in the amount of investment, and from a perspective of diversifying. And so China is seen as the potential source of new forms of investment. So part of this is also about
Belt and Road
wooing.
Initiative.
Yes.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, not at all. I think you captured it very well.
Mhm.
It's a growth. It's a strategic growth initiative. Yes.
Sure. Okay. But on that question though, and I want to follow up with that because as you well know, and I'm sure you were following this, President Biden had a meeting with President Yoon of South Korea and Prime Minister Kishida of Japan. And this is obviously through the lens of China, as you were just saying, which you describe as one of the deficiencies of the Biden administration and the policy towards China. But there's going to come a time, unless you disagree, that people within Southeast Asia are going to have to make a choice. Where do you think Malaysia is going to come down at? And do you think having to make that choice, what would be the implications of that? And I say that in the context Fareed Zakaria was interviewing the presumptive successor in Singapore and talking about what would happen if they had to make a choice. Do you think it will ever come to that? And what do you think would happen if it did come to that?
So Lawrence Wong would have been very strategic from Singapore and how he answered that question. So I will also try to be strategic in how I answer this question as well. From a perspective of analysis, no one in Southeast Asia wants to be forced to make a choice. And if you make a person make a choice, they may make the choice that you don't want. And I think that what is happening is that many Southeast Asian countries are being pressured by both sides to make choices. And I think that what we see is Southeast Asian countries trying to not to placate, but to strategically position themselves. And I think we have to understand that these countries are making strategic choices that within the parameters of which the choices they can make. They have a lot of agency that, they're not just being played on by outside partners. They're choosing, to position. Where would Malaysia choose? I think that the fact of the matter is that most Southeast Asian countries have to recognize that China is a bigger player in Southeast Asia. It's closer. It's more important for a perspective of trade. And I think that their first choice would be not to make a choice, and they would find many strategies to try to avoid a choice. But when pushed, they may be pushed into a place that many in the United States will be surprised that they would go.
What do you think would be the ultimate implications of that? Because if they did move away from the West, US in particular, that doesn't go unheeded by the Biden administration. It may go unheeded by another administration should somebody else win. But what do you think would be the ultimate implication of that if they did make that choice that the United States didn't like?
So let's step back first and let me give a bit of context that I think is useful. Most in Southeast Asia are looking about what's happening in Northeast Asia. And as you rightly talked about, the very important conversation between Japan, Korea, that the Biden administration helped to try to work towards helping to improve their relationship. Because what's happening in Northeast Asia, particularly over Taiwan, but also vis-a-vis issues of China, do matter, because there is a concern that this is a flashpoint for potential conflict in the region. Southeast Asian countries are watching this very carefully. They know that the U.S. plays an extremely important strategic role, but they also are concerned about escalating conflict, which would potentially have spillover effects. So the security dynamic would also impact how Southeast Asian countries would make their choices. It is important to understand that many Southeast Asian countries, including Malaysia, have very good security ties with the United States. And I think this is an important dimension, even if the economic ones are not as strong as they might be or potentially could be. The second issue is that for many Southeast Asian countries, there is a whole spectrum of points of engagement. So what we see in the context of the West, there's Europe, which is now having, and many individual countries are having their own policies toward engaging Southeast Asia. We also have much more synergies between Southeast Asia and Japan and Korea, which we did not see as much before in these middle power arrangements. And so I think that even if there's a moving away from the West, there'll still be kind of partners that are tied into the West that are going to be close to Southeast Asian countries. And so there are multiple points of engagement that implicitly allow for a continued type of discourse and engagement. So the challenge is not to push and ratchet up the choices to a point where it becomes more challenging. Is to find the points where the engagement can stay strong and continue to have dialogue, to make it a kind of strategic engagement, recognizing that there will be areas of difference where countries have to move in slightly towards China in one way or slightly towards the United States as another. So, an illustration of this is what's happened on the choices of 5G, right? So, which is which companies should you choose, right? And if you push too hard, you're not going to get the answer you want, right? If you make it a high stake game, as opposed to finding some sort of compromise position that allows a kind of different actors, and you have to figure out again, just as Malaysia needs to pick its battles vis-a-vis China or the United States needs to pick its battle vis-a-vis Malaysia or the other Southeast Asian countries. And I think, the time when the U.S. says and people follow is over. It's over. But the fact is that there are some things that are more important and that can be couched in particular ways compared to others. And I think it's a question of being able to translate those priorities in a more effective policy engagement. And this is where, as I said earlier, if your focus is only on China as opposed to what Southeast Asian countries want, then you're losing opportunities to strengthen that relationship.
One of the issues that we did not get into is the issue of Myanmar and the civil war that's going on there. What's been Malaysia's role in trying to resolve that issue, which has been going on for God knows how long? It's not a new thing, it's been going on for decades. What's their role in that?
So I think, since the 2021 coup, where the military junta it took another power grab back at power, we've seen in Myanmar a horrific death toll and economic toll on Myanmar society. Malaysia, along with Indonesia and Singapore, have been the most proactive in Southeast Asian countries to question and to kind of resist and challenge junta rule within the context of ASEAN. Anwar Ibrahim has come out and publicly on multiple occasions to use these phrases of carving Myanmar out of ASEAN. And that position has perhaps been one of the most, should we say, clear in terms of sending a message that the junta has actually, overstepped its bounds. But I think that Southeast Asian countries still wrestle with a kind of a solution. What we see in Indonesia's chairmanship of ASEAN this last year is that the focus point has been on trying to kind of bring dialogue between the different partners, not recognizing that, people on both sides, especially the unity government and the resistance forces, don't want to have dialogue with murderers and people, and so they're not willing to engage the junta because of its crimes against humanity that are systematic. So I think that ASEAN has failed miserably to find a kind of working strategy. And Malaysia, it will assume the leadership of ASEAN in 2025. And I think the question will be whether or not in the next 2 years, Malaysia can come up with an alternative strategy, because it's unlikely that this is going to happen under the next chairman, which is Laos. I think that the fact that Anwar Ibrahim recognizes how serious and how devastating the junta has been for Myanmar and for the region, right? Because it hurts. It's not just hurting Myanmar, well, although they're the ones taking the majority of the brunt, but by far, it is also impacting the region because it's splitting the regional organization as well as, bringing conflict to the region. So I think Malaysia's position has been more, I think, forward-looking, of recognizing that a solution to Myanmar doesn't rest with the junta at the negotiating table. It rests with the junta not having as much of a role in political life. The question becomes how to get there and how to bring the other countries on board towards that direction.
Bring this full circle, even though he's only been in office for a few months. Prime Minister Ibrahim has a lot on this plate between the internal tensions in terms of ethnic tensions, also the external issues that are going on, South China Sea, relationships with China, as well as the United States. How do you think he's going to handle this over the next few months? or can he? Does he have the political skill and the allies to become a successful prime minister for Malaysia?
I think, first of all, while he didn't receive a very strong mandate in the August polls, I think one can look at the 8 months of his administration and do see some important reforms, such as on child rights and some of the areas associated with introducing and discussing some economic reforms. He has laid out an economic vision. So I think, in 8 months, we do see some modest shifts and changes that are positive for Malaysia. Anwar Ibrahim's strength is that he has a lot of international allies. He's well respected in the international community. The challenge in the short term is that he's going to be focused internally and continuing to try to shore himself up domestically. And where the focal point will be how successfully he does this in the area of the economy. I think that, I see his leadership as having tremendous potential. If we compare it to other alternatives that are vying for the prime ministership, Anwar Ibrahim comes to this position with the most experience, and he also comes with the strongest international support. And what we saw in the polls is that his political base came back and supported him again, which is why all three of his parties, state governments were elected back. So I think he has some space. But the question will be whether or not he gets caught up in trying to be defensive and to continue the kind of tactics that he used in the first 8 months, which I don't think were that successful for him. And whether or not he can get out of that mode into something that is more reform-oriented, more kind of concrete in terms of policy deliverables, less talking, more focus. This may move him and move the electorate more towards a positive direction. He's got a bit of window of time, but he still faces a bombardment from the opposition. And the question is for him not to overreact, but to focus on getting the deliverables done.
You know the electorate because in the last election, you called every race with the exception, I believe, of 6. You were wrong in maybe 6 out of over 200 elections that was going on. So you know the pulse of the population. Will the population give him the space in the room to deliver the things that he wants to deliver?
I think that, Malaysia has a more demanding electorate. And we saw, the leaders are being pushed from all political parties to deliver. I think that he will have some space. He will have some space, but what will depend on whether or not his coalition in parliament stays together. And at the elite level, he controls 2/3 of the parliament. If that coalition stays together, he doesn't have to face a national election until 2027. And even though he may lose by-elections between now and then, he still holds the government. So he has at least some time to be able to continue to try to focus on those deliverables. If he gets caught up in the politics and focusing on trying to win every by-election, he's going to lose the big picture.
Guest today has been Bridget Welsh. She's an expert on Malaysian politics, and I want to thank her for being here with me today. Bridget, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Tony, for inviting me. It's a real honor.
And thank you all for listening today, and join us again next week as we will have another issue of international and global importance here on the Aguilar Conversations, A Global Perspective.
The Aguilar Conversations, A Global Perspective, is produced by Casa Margo Communications Group.